David is a friend, a brother in Christ. He's a former combat medic, and he was in Sadr City, Iraq, which is one of the hottest spots in the world. He has a local connection with in a small group with Anthony Schmaltz. I won't steal all your stuff.
Sure.
I just want to introduce you to David Mathias. Give him a warm Chippewa Valley greeting. I feel like I better shut up and
all right. Well, now I see my slides disappeared. Well, we'll get to that in a second. Before I get into the Army, anybody like Big Ten football? Okay, all right. Well, I'm pretty excited about Big Ten football coming up here in a couple of weeks, but here's the problem. I don't want to lose my audience on Act 1 here, but I am a Michigan guy. Okay, my apologies. But I'm going to tell you a story. Keith and I were talking a little bit about this. How many of you ever went to a Promise Keepers event years ago? Familiar with Promise Keepers and the great work they did? Remember Bill McCartney, who is the Colorado football coach who founded that organization? I told Keith, I said, I got an interesting connection to Bill McCartney. He said, oh, tell me. And if you all remember, there was a football game that happened around about 1993-94. Don't quote me on the date. And the Colorado Buffaloes were playing at the Big House in Michigan. Of course, I didn't miss a game as a student there. And if you remember how that game went, it came right down to literally to the last play. And let me tell you the punchline: God cares about Michigan football. Okay? And I'm going to prove it to you. It came down to the last play. Colorado's somewhere around the 50-yard line. You can go back and look at the film. And Ann Arbor, Michigan is about as liberal as you can get, right? A lot of people didn't care for Coach McCartney because of what he stood for and what he did with Promise Keepers. And wouldn't you believe, Colorado calls a timeout. They're on the sideline, and in that relatively quiet stadium, as quiet as you can get with 110,000 fans, somebody stands up about 10 rows behind Coach McCartney and says, "Hey, Coach, where's your God now?" So everybody could hear it. Look it up on YouTube. The rest is history. Cordell Stewart stepped back, threw it to the end zone, it got tipped, and Colorado won the game. God cares about Michigan football. Big Ten football. What a cool way for God to display what he can do. I'd have to hope that whoever stood up and said that, and maybe a few others around, had an aha moment right then. Okay? Before I get too much farther, how many veterans in the crowd here? Wow! Awesome. Last time I shared this talk, I think there were maybe 6 or 7, so this is a great representation. I'm going to narrow that down a little bit. How many Army guys? Wow, most. Any first cav guys? First cav. Okay. Well, I got a book here. Boy, I was trying to think of different ways to filter this. Let me take a step back. Who's the youngest guy in the house today? Anybody in their 20s? 20s? Anybody beat that? All right, I'll give you this copy of the book. So, and I'll tell you more about this book in just a moment. So I'm going to play you a little video clip. There's no dialogue here, but it shows a scene of an incident I'm going to tell you about. So, and I won't go into too much detail. Just take it in, and then I'll explain some context here in just a moment. Not too pleasant, is it? I'll come back to that in a little bit. And before I get too far, I got to tell you two connections here. So, and they're in the front and the back, line of sight here. So Anthony Schmoltz, who many of you know, he and I and our families were in a small group together for several years in Wausau before they moved here. And it was amazing to compare notes and realize I have a senior in high school, he has a sophomore in high school now, and when we first met, they were this size. And lest I think I'm real important or anything like that, Bob Hoff in the back knew me when I was in diapers. Literally. We lived about 2 blocks from each other when I was born, so really great to see Bob today. I want to talk a little bit about this combat experience and a particular slice of it and tell you some stories, because we all like a story, right? And help you understand how I got thrown into the middle of what you just saw. So what you see is a movie depiction of about a 24-hour period real early in my time in Iraq. And you know that if it was a movie, made into a movie, it was bad, right? They don't make the mundane, boring parts of a combat tour into a movie, and so I'll give you a little bit of that context. But really what I want to bring it down to is how that experience, and while I would have never chosen it, has profoundly impacted me, my life, my children consequently, and so many other things. And how many of you know when God wants to take your life and shape it in a different way, it can be really terribly painful. You see all the steps that you have to go through. You say, God, here's the guy I want to be. I want to be a leader. I want to be somebody who cares about other people. I want to, do all these things, but to get to that point can be a very painful, difficult process. I don't know about you, if 2020 has been a great year for you, I want to talk because I want to know what the secret sauce is. We've all gone through a rough year, regardless of how this has impacted you. And I want to just share with you some events that have shaped my life and show you how God took the chisel to my heart in a lot of ways and brought me through some pretty awful things to be able to sit and share stories with you today, okay? So if you see that guy and you see me, that's a different guy than who I am today. This is the day we were packing up to convoy from Kuwait up to Iraq. A little bit of background. I'm a kid who grew up in Nekoosa, Wisconsin, a little bitty town there. My parents were public school teachers. My dad was a builder. And eventually, when I was about 14, my parents felt a call to mission work. We picked up and moved to Europe. So I spent my high school years in Belgium, came back, went to Michigan, went through my undergrad years, and then I got to medical school, and I went, wow, that's a whole lot of money. And I really don't want to have a 6-figure debt when I graduate from medical school. And through a series of circumstances, signed up and joined the Army. Got one of their scholarships. So literally, the government footed the entire bill for me to go to medical school. It was one of the greatest gifts I've ever received. But that was a peacetime. We were past the Gulf War and had no idea what that little bit of ink would mean in the long run, right? How many of you have done that before? You signed up for something and you didn't know where you were headed. Thank the Lord I didn't know, because I would have turned and run at that point had I not seen this. But thank the Lord that I didn't know, and He led me that direction. Joined the Army and went through medical school, went through residency training, and one September morning in 2001, I was soloing in the newborn intensive care unit. So here I am as a pediatrician, taking care of babies. I had about 20 or 25 babies I had to take care of that morning. And the nurses had the radio on. And we heard about the Twin Towers and about the Pentagon. 9/11, 2001. I'm a senior resident, and I got a uniform on. And all of us looked at each other and said, life's about to change in a big way. That whole peacetime thing that we signed up under was no longer the case. So fast forward a year, I was set to go to Iraq with a Patriot missile battery out of Fort Bliss, Texas, where I was stationed. And my wife was pregnant. She was due in February, and if you remember, the invasion was in March, so we were amassing troops, getting ready to go in. And I said, surely, God, you wouldn't send me away and miss my first baby's birth. That didn't fit my theology, right? God, you know, I'm a good guy. Take care of me. Don't, you know, all that. Well, I got orders about 2 weeks later that I wasn't going. Thank you, Lord. You answered my prayer. You know, wasn't that wonderful? Little did I know that about 8 weeks later, I got another set of orders. Well, you didn't go that time, but you're going to go this time. Turns out that unit went and came back in a matter of 3 or 4 months. And would that had happened, but this wouldn't have happened then. So, long story short, here I am on a convoy in a field litter ambulance with no windows, bumping along roads leading up to the Iraqi border. The only mercy there was that this vehicle broke down and they had to tow it, so then I got to sit in a Humvee where I could see out the front. Okay. 2 days later, we're rolling into Baghdad, and I'm in a Humvee with no door on the side. The reason they did that was if you had a thin metal door and you had an IED blow off, that door's not going to protect you at all. All it does is become more shrapnel to penetrate your body. So they felt like it was better to be in a vehicle without a door on the side. But holy cow, that was a gut check. And pulled into this camp called Camp War Eagle on the north side of Baghdad. It's an area called Sadr City that was billed as the safest place in Iraq. The reason for that was that it was a big Shiite area. If you remember history, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Muslim and built this massive area on the northeast side of Baghdad for Shiites to live and work menial labor jobs. And if you look at Sadr City, it looks like a big rectangle turned on its corner with huge wide boulevards. Why did he do that? Well, when he constructed that area, he said, I want big wide boulevards so I can roll my tanks up and down and crush any sort of rebellion that might come out of this area. And that's exactly what he did. So this is an area that had known oppression, terror, poverty, worse than any of us have ever seen. And so when the Americans rolled in, we said, hey, great, the Shiites are going to welcome us with open arms. And that was the case for that unit that was in there before us. They had had no combat for several months by the time we had gotten there. They had had a total of, I think, 3 battle casualties. Little did we know, but our command structure did know that things were not going well. There was a lot of unrest. We had a lot of young, angry men who were unemployed and had nothing else to do, and began to listen to some of the radical clerics that were starting to drum up anti-American sentiment. And literally, we walked right into the crosshairs of that. So this is what was brewing. This is our command building right in the middle of camp. Just to give you a little picture, this was a former Republican Guard camp. If you remember the Republican Guard, they were Saddam Hussein's henchmen, committed all sorts of atrocities. We lived in their camp where they had been housed and trained. And again, Sadr City, safest place in Iraq. And really our plan was to go in and do some nation building. And as a pediatrician, that was exciting to me. We knew ahead of time there were a couple of major hospitals there. We knew their resources were limited. Hey, wouldn't it be great to walk alongside some of our Iraqi counterparts and help them build up their medical infrastructure? We were ready to do that. The next day, I ended up in a convoy going down to the green zone in Baghdad. If you remember, it was an area that was walled off, secured, and we were going down there to run some supplies, and they said, hey, Doc, why don't you come along? And I did, against my better judgment. And riding along in an unarmored vehicle with one of my medics as a driver, and I'm in the right seat. And wouldn't you know, we're in a convoy of 4 vehicles, and 1 vehicle breaks down. So here we are in the center of Baghdad, traffic everywhere, and we've got to stop. That's the last place you want to be. And here I am as a doctor, Okay, you don't go through grunt school as a doctor. You go through, my brother called it knife and fork school. Officer basic training in an air-conditioned hotel in San Antonio. And here I am sitting next to my medic, and he says, "Doc, this vehicle's the last place you want to be sitting when it's sitting still." Hands me his M16 and says, "Go set up a perimeter." And literally, here I am taking a knee on the side of the road in Baghdad, and had the conscious thought, I think I said it out loud, how in the world did I get here? That was that little signature on a paper, right? How did I get here? That was about April 2nd. And April 4th, we had a routine convoy of one small group of troops basically learning the lay of the land, driving through the city, limited communication with the Tactical Operations Center, that were driving through and got ambushed. They got hit on the front end and then realized that it was a coordinated ambush. So they start radioing in, and within moments, their gunner, Eddie Chen, is dead. And we get all this information over the radio. And the first thought is, oh my goodness, nobody had any idea that anything like this was brewing. But nobody understood the scope of the problem until we began to send in a chock of rescue vehicles, and they also got ambushed in every ingress and egress from the city. What unfolded over the next 6 or 8 hours in great intensity, you can watch now. So National Geographic put this together into a mini-series, about 8 hours. What I will tell you is when you watch that, if you have combat experience, it's going to be really hard to watch. So don't run out here, watch that, and then come back and blame me for a flare-up of your PTSD symptoms. Honestly, it's hard to watch. But I will also tell you it's a very toned-down version. There are a couple of scenes where they show troops walking through the streets and trying to, get their vehicle started, and that couldn't be any farther from the truth. Every troop in that city, from the moment he drove in to the moment he drove out, was under constant direct fire. Well, here I am sitting in an aid station about the size of your garage with very limited supplies. I've got one other doctor with me who's an emergency medicine doctor, and we've got a doctor from the outgrowing group, and I've got about 40 combat medics who are as green can be. We had one or two medics who had been in the Gulf War and had a little bit of experience. These guys were well trained, they were smart, they had all the equipment and absolutely no experience actually taking care of combat casualties. And over the course of about the next 3 hours, we had about over 60 combat wounded soldiers right through that garage. So what you saw in that video is actually far better than it was. They depict that it was in these tents, and guys were up on stretchers, and we could work on them there. Now the reality is virtually everyone was on the ground. The most critical troops were inside the aid station, working with very limited resources to try to keep these guys alive. And as the dust settled, 8 young Americans didn't come home that night. And over 50 were evacuated out with various wounds and injuries. This is the aftermath. This is later that night in that aid station. I don't have to go into detail to help you understand what you're looking at. These are two of the finest Americans that you'll ever know. Joe Crozier and Adam Elliott. Haven't seen these guys for about, well, I saw them at 10 years after the fact. 2014, we had a reunion, but amazing guys. No combat experience at all until that night. All of a sudden, they were the most experienced combat medics in the country at that point. And a few days later, a memorial to pay respects to those 8 young men. Well, things from that point on continued for about 79 days of straight combat. Typically, the pattern was daytimes, the city would sort of come alive and people would try to live a relatively normal life. And at night, it was a night in, night out struggle to maintain control of police stations and critical infrastructure in the city. We had an opportunity to, at times when things would settle down after those first 3 months, to get into some of the local hospitals and to try to bring some help and assistance, but it never lasted long because of the struggle to control that city. I showed you a picture of a doctor that we worked alongside. As a pediatrician, again, I had envisioned going in and helping to better the health of Iraqi children. This was about as close as it got. Occasionally we'd run into a kid on the street. Now you're looking at me going, he doesn't have a Kevlar or a flak vest on. This was actually in the green zone in Baghdad. A rare event to be outside and not be wearing all that gear. I knew you'd need a little comic relief at this point. Give you 3 guesses which one's me. This is Lieutenant Colonel David Rabb, who led a combat stress unit out of Minnesota, so mostly reservists. And we worked alongside one another because he brought in mental health professionals to literally go on patrols with troops and talk with them, and everything off the record, because guys were afraid to talk about their mental health when they thought it would show up in their medical records. I see a lot of nodding heads, right? But if these guys would strap on a Kevlar and go out on a patrol and talk to troops, they did some unbelievable work. I got to talk to Colonel Rabb just a couple of months ago. He called me out of the blue, and it was pretty special to connect with him again. We had some times of getting to use our pediatric skills. So this is teaching newborn resuscitation to 23 Iraqi doctors. We did get a chance to do some hands-on care. But it was a gut check to realize that these Iraqi doctors were putting their lives on the line simply to come and attend my class. Because if the militias knew that they were collaborating with Americans, their lives would be at risk. Unbelievable. We went to take some pictures at times, and they were very hesitant to take pictures. Middle of all this, middle of that year, I was able to come back. When I left, I had a 1-year-old son, and my wife was 2 months pregnant. And that's a whole separate story how I ended up being there for the birth of my second son, who's now 16 years old and just about to get his driver's license. So, and subsequent to that, I've got 4 more kids, so 6 kids. And this was reunion on the parade field at Fort Hood, Texas, a few months later. 364 days from the day I left Fort Hood to when I got back. You say, well, that's interesting. Why 364? Well, once you hit 365, they have to start paying you more. So they got every last minute out of our deployment. And here my wife, Rhonda, of now 20 years. So I want to share a little bit about this person. I think a lot of you probably know her or have seen her. This is Martha Raditz with ABC. And Martha's subsequently become a very close friend. And if you know Martha's politics, she and I are probably on very different ends of the spectrum. But Martha came in a few months after April 4th and met with our division commander, General Corelli, and she said, as a media person, I want to tell the story. I want to tell the story of what our troops are going through here. And he had the sense that her intentions were nothing other than that. And he said, well, I got a group of guys up in Sadr City I need you to come talk to. And so she landed, and like so many other media folks that had come through, and I could name a lot of names that you'd be familiar with, and came in and told stories that weren't exactly right. We were all hesitant to talk to her at first. And she likes telling these stories now, all the guys that sat down and gave interviews for Nightline. We were very hesitant to open up. But after that first episode of Nightline aired and we saw what she produced, she had our deepest respect as someone who literally wanted to tell the story. And the book that you have in your hand that she published a few years later tells that whole story of April 4th. But not just that, it kind of bounces back and forth between what guys experienced in the field, what we experienced in the aid station. There are a couple chapters that'll go into detail about what you saw there in the video. But what families experienced back home. And I think she did a phenomenal job. Subsequent to that, National Geographic picked it up and made a mini-series out of it. Well, a couple years ago, we took a family trip to Washington, D.C. And wouldn't you know, she caught wind of it, and and treated our family to a night on the town, and I still communicate with her regularly. And I think it's just been a beautiful thing to see someone who we probably wouldn't have a whole lot of common ground, but we found a tremendous amount through this. And I think we need a little more of that in today's society, don't we? Here's the guy I want to talk about a little bit more, and all of you serve in leadership in some way. You might say, well, I'm retired, or I don't have a leadership role. But we all know that all of us, no matter where we are in our lives or in our careers, are leaders because people look to us to lead. I learned very quickly in combat that leadership has absolutely nothing to do with a title or even the rank on your shoulder. We had graduates from West Point who were some of the smartest guys you could ever imagine. You look at them on paper and they're phenomenal. You'd pick them to work in your company because of their credentials, and got out into the street under fire and crumpled, literally, and couldn't lead their troops. And we learned quickly that a leader, by definition, at the most basic sense, you are a leader if people follow you. You're not a leader by decree. This is a guy who has impacted my life in profound ways since then. You see on his hat here 3 stars, and that's where his career ended up. He just retired a few months ago. But at that time, he was Lieutenant Colonel Gary Valesky. He was my battalion commander. And I got an opportunity, I got a front row seat for 364 days, and actually a few days of training before we went, to see the greatest leader I've ever had a chance to serve under. And I want to tell you some of the takeaways from that experience. Again, when I look back and I say, Lord, I wouldn't have chosen this year for anything. I wouldn't have chosen this opportunity. If I had known that scholarship was going to lead to 1,160 some mortars landing inside the camp, one of which was between me and the camera there, that was strong enough to feel like somebody punched me in the chest. To see blood and carnage and young people dying many years before they should have, I would have turned and run. But I would have missed out on this. And this was one of God's greatest gifts to me, was a battalion commander who taught me so many things. This is a question that I've thought about, and it came from an interview I heard from, I believe it was the first female general in the Marine Corps, and don't ask me her name right now. I heard it a couple years ago when I put this together. And the interviewer said, tell me about the military now that you're retiring compared to the military when you first went in. She had 30-some years of experience. And she said, oh, that's simple. I'm all ears. What are you talking about here? She said, whereas we used to train leaders, we now train managers. We train people to standards that look really great on paper. But what I'm talking about is true leadership, as I've shared with you already. Well, what does that look like? I'm going to give you some lessons that I gleaned from, and you see Lancer 6. Lancer 6 was his radio call sign, Lieutenant Colonel Gary Valesky. I still can't call him Gary. He's sir to me, and now General. Couple stories. Lead from the front. So not too long after April 4th, things had settled down for a day or two, and Colonel Valesky was making connections with local leaders in the community, trying to build bridges between the U.S. military to accomplish our purpose. And he and his group were convoying through the city, and all of a sudden, the young man that's running the gun turret in his Humvee gets sick. This was common, where guys are walking through raw sewage in the streets. It's hard to stay clean, and guys got sick. Intestinal disease regularly. We treated it all the time in our aid station. And so the young man who's protecting him as the battalion commander is sick and can't do his job. pulls over the convoy, and what do you think he did? He took this 18, 19-year-old kid and he put him in his seat, and he himself got up and manned the 240. And all these guys who are responsible for his safety and security go absolutely nuts. Sir, you can't do that. It's the most dangerous job here. And he looks down and he says, noted, drive on. Drove through the most dangerous part of Iraq at that time. It was Sadr City and Fallujah at the time, if you remember, as in the most vulnerable position. What do you think that did to those guys under his command? We would have followed him anywhere before that, but that story circulated like that. And I'll tell you, it would be hard for me to think of any other experience in my entire life where I was led in that sort of way. I wasn't on that convoy, but you can better believe that impacted every guy in that unit and around. I love this second quote from General Patton, always do everything you ask of those you command. And I could tell you many, many stories. The one that shocked me the most was we were in Kuwait getting ready to convoy up and standing in line waiting for dinner, and there were so many troops and it took so long. And to turn around and find your battalion commander standing behind you in line, when all it would take was one word to pull rank and step in front, and he stood behind me. And not just him, but General Peter Corelli, two-star general, standing behind you in line. Amazing. Number 3 is a high point and low point of my military career. Probably the low point, actually. And I'll just be real vulnerable with you here. So we recovered from April 4th, ongoing combat operations, and by that point we're getting a little bit used to this. That's a problem, isn't it? Used to carnage and limbs amputated and guys trying to die. We're a few months down the line, and it was probably 7 or 8 casualties that were hit by a roadside bomb just outside our camp. And so me, as a physician, I'm responsible for everything that goes in and out of this aid station. Yes, a lot of other guys carry out the mission, but in the end, that's the way it works in the military. It falls on the guy who's in charge. Well, we assess what's going on and who needs to fly out and who can stay, and battlefield triage. And I'm working on one soldier who I'm sure isn't going to make it if we don't get him on a helicopter to an operating room soon. We have no operating capabilities there, but about a 10-minute helicopter flight. So we call for a medevac. And you can imagine, in the height of combat, that command group has to know what you're doing. We're about 100 yards down the way. And so we call up to the operations center. We say we need a helicopter, and they're gonna fly in and take our casualties, and they do, and that's fine. Well, about 5 minutes later, I'm working on another soldier, and I realized that this guy also needs to be flown out, and we short-circuited the process. I don't know where the breakdown was, but that call went to medevac before it went through the operations center. Interestingly, we have artillery sitting right next to the helipad. So an artillery that's locked and loaded and ready to counterfire, and a helicopter flying in is a recipe for disaster. They fly in, and fortunately, thank the Lord, that this was recognized before disaster happened. They land, we load the casualty, they fly out, and I still don't have any idea what's happened. It's out of my line of sight. I get a call to go sit down and have a heart-to-heart with Lancer 6. And you better believe I was there in about 30 seconds. And from that point on, I won't tell you everything he said because it was a hard conversation. Did you realize that I need to know everything that goes in and out of this camp? Did you realize that we were about ready to counterfire? Did you realize that your decision, even though I hadn't made the call, but I'm responsible, could have cost the lives of 10, 12, 15 great Americans? And I'll tell you what, that was a tough moment to realize, yes, that did fall on me. He lets me go, and I stood up and literally 3 seconds later, before I could walk away, he comes up. If it wasn't coronavirus, I'd do this to Anthony. Grabbed me by the collar and pulled me about 3 inches from his nose. And he said, "Doc, you're doing an amazing job. Keep up the good work." Can you imagine that? I mean, absolutely lowest to the highest point of my entire experience was right there in those 3 seconds. That's leadership, folks. Deal with the problem. He doesn't want to cost any lives any more than we already have. And he's responsible. It's on him. What an impact on my life. How does that affect how I lead my kids, how I lead my coworkers? I sure hope it's a good thing. I've made mistakes. We all have as leaders. But wow, what an impactful experience. Who else needs to know? Every command group meeting that we had, sitting and talking about operations, there was literally a piece of butcher block paper torn off and taped onto the wall in the operations center, and scrawled on there was, "Who else needs to know?" We can have a phenomenal plan, a phenomenal battle plan, and know exactly where we're going and what we're doing, but if that unit that's a half a mile away doesn't know, it's going to cost us in a big way. I think that's a great takeaway. Be ridiculously positive. He was amazing. I'll tell you what, we had times when it was cold, it was rainy, you know, we were bored, things just weren't going our way. And I can count on one hand the number of times that I felt like he wasn't just over the top positive as a leader. Realistic, of course, but positive, absolutely. As a side note, Colonel Valesky grew up in Spokane, Washington, and I still never got to the bottom as to how he's a Packer fan. He's one of the most rabid Packer fans I've ever met. It does. You know, it's a character issue, isn't it? So he and I would talk about the Packers regularly through the season. I mean, how interesting. Rank didn't matter when we were talking about the Packers. Accept responsibility and deflect praise. Here's a guy who led a battalion through the unthinkable on April 4th, and I'll tell you there were many more stories, not quite on that scale, but just some incredible things that he did. And over the course of the year, it's not too many battalion commanders that leave Iraq with a Silver Star and a Purple Heart, and he did both, and many other decorations. So naturally, people want to talk to this guy. And hey, what's he made of? Tell us your take on what's going on in Iraq. And he got media request after media request. And you know what he would do? Took a few of them for the betterment of the military. But you know what he would do most of the time? A reporter would come in and he'd say, "You don't want to talk to me." He'd turn and he'd say, "You want to talk to Private Jones from Arkansas. Go sit and talk to him. Find out his story." That's the real story of what's going on here. And I saw him do that more times than I can count. Responsibility when things didn't go right, you never heard him turning and blaming anyone. He dealt with the problems, but he accepted the responsibility. Powerful impact on me. Number 7, honor your home team. He talked about his family regularly. He had a wife who he met on an active service, and she had subsequently left the military, especially as he was rising in rank. And they had a son who was born very prematurely, 20-some weeks gestation, had multiple health problems, and was that kid that you know, isn't going to be the valedictorian or isn't going to be the captain of the football team. You wouldn't know it by how Colonel Valesky talked about his son. I told you his call sign was Lancer 6, right? Because of our battalion name. He called his wife Household 6. He knew who was in charge at home. Put things into perspective. I'll tell you, we needed some perspective after April 4th and 89 straight days of combat after that. And I remember so many times him saying, "Let me tell you guys a story." As the U.S. was assessing the situation in the 1940s and trying to decide whether or not to get involved in the theater in Europe, there were a lot of people who said we didn't have any business fighting a war in Europe. And he said, I want you to know that, because you're going to hear people that say there's no reason that we should be in Iraq right now. But when we look back at World War II, is there anyone who would question the validity of why we went and what we accomplished there? He said, my hope and prayer is that when you talk to your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids someday, we can look back on this experience and say it was worth it all. As someone who was there, I can honestly say I think that story is still being written. There's only so much power and influence and control we have, and I have to put that all on the sovereignty of God, that He put us there at that time to do what we did and to do it well. But to contextualize, put things into context, help it to make sense. When it really counts, to not accept no. If my kids were here today, they would say one of Dad's favorite quotes is, there's a yes answer somewhere. Colonel Valesky's rule was, you can tell me about any problem that's going on in this unit right now, as long as you have a proposed solution for it. You may not be right, but you're not going to tell me about a problem without proposing a solution. I love that. Did I say lead from the front? That was number 1, and number 10, and number 11, and keep going down the line. As a doctor, I saw some interesting things that year. One of the most interesting was seeing my own battalion commander in a command meeting, and I was sitting off to his left. And I know it was his left because I was looking at his face. And as a doctor, I'm going, what is that rash? I'm responsible for his health as the doctor for the unit. I'm sitting there going, what is that? And he's got red circles all over the left side of his face, but not on the right side. I love telling this to groups of doctors because their diagnostic brains start going, well, that could be this infection, could be that. Anybody have any idea what that was?
Pencil mark.
A pencil mark? About that size, but it wasn't that. And I'll tell you, you get closer and you can tell they're burns.
Thinking sunburns from bullet holes in vehicles.
So you're getting close. We're getting real close. So if you can picture a commander riding in his up-armored Humvee on the right side, he's got a driver, and he's got a window that goes down. And if you're going to fire your M4 or your M16, what are you going to do? Fire it with your left arm, and the spent shell casings fly out of there and hit your face. Here's a guy who had every right, based on his rank, to be sitting in an operations center, taking calls on the radio and watching computer screens and directing the battle from the rear. He made a decision day one that was going to be XO Major Martin Dannett, who sat behind the computer screen, and he's going to lead his troops in the city. And he did it over and over and over again. That's leadership, leading from the front. I don't ever expect in my life that I'll ever work for someone like this again. I wouldn't put that expectation on anyone. But what a profound impact that's had. I know we're getting close to time. I don't want to keep you long. I think that clock's off, but I'll believe it. 15-year perspective, now 16-year. And there's a verse I put up here that you all can probably quote, or most of you can. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper and not to harm you, to give you what? A hope and a future. Go to any graduation party at a Christian family, and this verse is going to be plastered everywhere. I know the plans I have for you, prosper and not to harm you, hope and a future. And you'd say, how in the world do you apply this to that experience? Really, Lord? I took care of Leslie Denise Jackson. I wanted to tell you her name today, an 18-year-old girl who got hit by a roadside bomb. And she could have been my patient in my pediatric clinic back home. How do you apply Jeremiah 29:11 to that? Or any number of other experiences. Read back a few verses. What was happening at the time is the people of Israel had been taken away from their homeland, and they were in exile in Babylon. And they were living under, essentially as slaves, in a foreign land. And all of a sudden, people start rising up, false prophets, and they say, oh, this thing won't last very long. You're going to be home by Christmas. Well, not quite that way, but it's going to be over really soon. You'll be back in your homeland. Everything will be fine. And what does Jeremiah do? Jeremiah stands up and he says, actually, God says this thing's not going to be over soon. It's going to last 70 years. So he says, plant gardens, live in homes, give your children in marriage. You can read it all. Keep living, positively impact the culture around you, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans not to harm you, but to prosper you, to give you a hope and a future. 70 years in captivity. 364 days in a combat situation felt like 70 years. A lot. How many of you think 2020 feels like 70 years? And we're not seeing the end, and if I see the end, it might be a train coming the other way, okay? I don't know where this is going. I don't know what the world's going to look like in 6 months or a year. But if there's anything to cling on to, it's, God, you got this. You got this situation. And by the way, let me not waste this experience. Let me not wish this away or ask for something else. Clearly, if we really believe in the sovereignty of God, God's really in control, do we think 2020 is any different? I can't go there, because if God's not in control, we're all sunk. God's in control. Doesn't mean it's got to be fun and happy. It's going to be okay. But I sincerely hope that you walk away with one thought, one thing from my experience, and you walk out and go, yeah, I think I could apply that today, or at least gain some perspective on what's going on in your own life, and continue to lead the people that you're called to lead in whatever your sphere of influence is. Thanks for the time today.
We're going to close this with a song that I want you to, the words will be on the screen, and I just want you to contemplate the words of this song as you listen to it. Some of you will know it, many will not.
Do you feel the world is broken? Do you feel the shadows deepen? But do you know that all the dark won't stop the light from getting through? Do you wish that you could see it all made new? Is all creation groaning? Is a new creation coming? Is the glory of the Lord to be the light within our midst? Is it good that we remind ourselves of this? Is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, who conquered the grave. He is David's root and the Lamb who died to ransom the slave. Is he worthy? Is he worthy of all blessing and honor and glory? Is he worthy of this? He is. Does the Father truly love us? Does the Spirit move among us? And is Jesus our Messiah? where God intended to dwell again with us. Is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, who conquered the grave. He is David's root and the Lamb who died to ransom the slave. From every people and tribe, every nation and tongue, he has made us a kingdom and priest to God to reign with the Son. Is he worthy? Is he worthy of all blessing and honor and glory? Is he worthy? Is he worthy?